January 1945, East Aachen. The night breathes frost and smoke. The war in Europe is breaking apart the last days of winter, and the rails that once carried Germany's armies now lie twisted in silence. In a bombed-out railway yard, American engineers move through the wreckage with lanterns and rifles. Their boots crunch over glass and ice. Steam seeps from the ruptured pipes of an abandoned locomotive, a German Kriegs that once hauled troops to the front. Now it sits still, scarred by shrapnel, its metal skin glowing faintly in the lantern light. A sergeant climbs into the cab, brushes off soot, and studies the gauges. The men behind him don't see a ruined machine. They see potential, armor, power, movement. In a war where trucks sink in mud and bridges vanish overnight, rails are still a lifeline. By dawn, sparks will light the air. Hammers will strike iron again. And a handful of American soldiers will turn this forgotten train into something new. A fortress on wheels. By the final winter of the war, Europe's arteries were shattered. Every road from Normandy to the Rhine was a ribbon of frozen mud, cratered by bombs and churned by armor. Bridges collapsed faster than they could be repaired. The front stretched thin. A living line of fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, and weary men trying to keep the advance alive. When the Allies broke through France in the summer of 1944, logistics had become a second battlefield. American divisions could outrun their supplies faster than planners could imagine. The U.S. Army called it the long tail of victory. Without fuel, artillery, or rations, even the most powerful army could stall. The U.S. Transportation Corps, and within it the railway operating battalions, carried a quiet but vital mission: reopen and run Europe's wrecked rail system. These were not glamorous soldiers. They were engineers, machinists, and switchman men who had worked the rails back home in Chicago, Kansas City, and Pittsburgh. They wore the same olive drab as the infantry, but their weapons were crowbars and wrenches. Through the autumn of 1944, they rebuilt Europe's veins mile by mile. German demolition teams had dynamited tunnels, mined yards, and burned bridges as they retreated. Entire locomotives were sabotaged, their boilers cracked, wheels fused by explosives. Still, the Americans kept moving. Using captured or abandoned equipment, they ran makeshift trains under fire to feed General Patton's Third Army and the First Army pressing toward the Rhine. Each yard they reached told the same story: twisted rails, cratered platforms, scattered freight cars filled with half-burned ammunition and papers. The Germans had relied on rail for everything: troop movement, logistics, even anti-aircraft batteries mounted on flat cars. When they fled, they left behind a ghost network of power waiting to be reclaimed. By late 1944, the front had shifted into the dense forests of the Ardennes. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last counteroffensive. The sudden push ruptured Allied supply lines, cutting roads and isolating units. Truck convoys were ambushed, snow-buried vehicles to their axles. In that chaos, the idea of using trains again, armored, self-contained, able to run on their own iron roads, began to sound less like nostalgia and more like necessity. American field engineers noticed something remarkable. Not all German trains were destroyed. Some engines had been abandoned intact when fuel ran out or crews fled. Others were damaged only superficially, their massive steel bodies untouched by fire. The U.S. Army possessed both the technical skill and the manpower to repair them quickly. And so, in the ruins of depots across Belgium and Western Germany, new life sparked from the embers of the Reich's industry. Crews from the 713th and 715th Railway operating battalions began cannibalizing parts from derelict locomotives, combining workable cars into short armored convoys. Their mission at first was simple: move supplies, evacuate wounded, haul prisoners. But soon, the threat of German counterattacks along the tracks forced a change in thinking. Machine guns were mounted on flat cars. Sandbags lined the open doors of boxcars. Spare armor plate from captured depots was welded onto fragile sides. Each addition was improvised, field-tested under fire. These trains became more than transport, they became survival platforms. The sound of their engines, deep and steady, echoed across valleys still haunted by snipers. To the men riding them, Every mile of rail felt like a reclaimed piece of Europe. And as the front crept closer to the Rhine, that improvised spirit would only grow stronger. By February 1945, the German army was in retreat on almost every front. Yet in the west, the terrain and winter slowed everything. Mud, snow, and shattered bridges made trucks unreliable. The U.S. Army's dependence on fuel convoys, so effective during the breakout from Normandy, had become a liability in the heart of Germany. Railroads, though damaged, still threaded through every valley and town. If the Americans could seize and restore them, they could move faster than the enemy could regroup. Captured rail yards along the Rhine, at places like Düren, Euskirchen, and Remagen, became laboratories of improvisation. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps worked shoulder to shoulder with the engineers and ordnance repair units. They found half-burned depots filled with machinery the Germans had abandoned. Lathes, welders, cranes, and tons of scrap armor plate. Nearby stood lines of freight cars, tank wagons, and passenger coaches left behind in the chaos. The first experiments came from necessity. In some sectors, sniper fire and hit-and-run attacks from scattered Wehrmacht units endangered every supply run. To protect these trains, American engineers began lining the cars with sandbags, mounting .30 caliber Browning machine guns at the doors, and cutting narrow firing slits into wooden panels. Then came bolder designs. A flat car would carry an M2 half-track, chained down but ready to fire its mounted gun. Another held a 37mm anti-aircraft cannon, scavenged from damaged vehicles. Some crews even mounted .50 caliber Brownings onto the roofs of locomotives, giving engineers defensive firepower against strafing aircraft. Reports in the field journals of the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies mention these conversions quietly. Train convoys with armed protection, field-modified rolling stock for forward areas. There was no formal directive, no blueprint from Washington. It was ingenuity born in mud and smoke. The Germans noticed. Wehrmacht patrols radioed reports of Panzerzug, armored trains, moving behind the Allied front, a term the Germans themselves had used earlier in the war for their own heavily armed rail weapons. But now they were seeing them under American flags. At first, many believed it was propaganda, an exaggeration of logistical movement. Then came encounters that proved otherwise. Near the town of Herth, west of Cologne, a German reconnaissance group fired on what they assumed was an unprotected supply train. The return fire was immediate. Bursts of tracers from hidden Brownings laced the treeline. The Germans withdrew, stunned by the realization that the Americans had learned their own methods and perfected them. Unlike the earlier German armored trains, which were heavy, slow, and vulnerable to air attack, the American versions were leaner, improvised with whatever materials were available. They carried supplies, troops, even medics, protected just enough to survive ambushes. Their advantage lay in flexibility. Each crew could modify its train differently, adapting to terrain and threat. These mobile fortresses also served a psychological purpose. In towns where civilians watched Allied convoys rumble past, the sight of U.S. soldiers standing alert on armored cars symbolized inevitability. The American advance had not stalled. It had adapted. German diaries captured after the war reflect the shock. One entry from a retreating artillery officer near Bonn reads, "They use everything we leave behind. Even our trains now serve them." For the U.S. soldiers, it wasn't about spectacle. It was about survival. Railways were the only arteries that could move large volumes of supplies when roads failed. And with the Rhine crossings approaching, every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every wounded man needed safe passage eastward. From the wreckage of the enemy's industrial empire, the Americans forged something symbolic of their entire war effort, a transformation of destruction into momentum. The engines once built to carry Germany's armies now powered their defeat. By March, as armored columns prepared to cross the Rhine, those improvised fortress trains had become vital links in the final push. Their story would never make the headlines, but among the men who built them, there was quiet pride. They had taken the tools of war's ruin and made them move again. And for the first time since D-Day, the rails of Europe began to hum once more under Allied control. Every fortress train began the same way, with a handful of men staring at wreckage and refusing to quit. They weren't elite units or specialized armor crews. Most were railway engineers from Pennsylvania, machinists from Detroit, and diesel mechanics from Texas. Men who, before the war, had kept America's industrial veins alive. When they reached Europe, they carried that same discipline with them. To these soldiers, the German rail yards weren't ruins. They were opportunities. An old locomotive was a challenge to solve. A burnt freight car was a project to rebuild. In a war that demanded invention every day, this was second nature. The 713th Railway Operating Battalion became a symbol of that spirit. Stationed near Liège and later along the Rhine, its men were trained to get anything on wheels moving. When German forces abandoned entire trains, these Americans set to work. With the hum of acetylene torches and the rhythm of hammers, they stripped, welded, and rebuilt. They had no manuals, no spare parts lists. What they had was experience, and an understanding of machinery that ran deeper than most officers could imagine. They scrounged steel plates from destroyed factories, bolted them to boxcars, and filled the gaps with sandbags. In some cases, they lined the interiors with timber from bombed-out warehouses. They used leftover armor skirts from German panzer wrecks to reinforce corners. The result was crude but effective, a car that could absorb small arms fire and still keep rolling. Weapons were improvised as well. Spare .30 caliber Brownings, M1919s, and even bazookas were mounted in the windows. Ammunition belts hung from hooks nailed into the wooden frames. Field telephones were wired along the length of the train, connecting the engineer's cab with the rear gunners. Some crews even rigged hand signals or colored flags to communicate during blackouts. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of humor and exhaustion. Men joked about riding the Pennsylvania Limited to Berlin, or called their creation the Freedom Express. Others simply painted names onto the locomotives: Maryland Bell, Victory Rail, Steel Thunder. Yet, beneath the laughter was tension. Every run through contested territory meant risk. Mines under the tracks, artillery fire, or a lone German gunner could destroy a car in seconds. The soldiers who volunteered to guard the trains knew the danger. They also knew the reward. If they succeeded, the front lines would keep moving. A corporal named Joseph Red Halvorsen from Minnesota wrote in a letter home in March 1945, "We ride on iron ghosts. These trains belonged to the enemy once. Now they serve us. Feels right somehow." That feeling, reclaiming the machinery of war and turning it against its makers, carried deep symbolism. It represented everything the U.S. Army had become by 1945. Adaptive, resourceful, relentless. The Germans had relied on engineering precision. The Americans relied on practical improvisation. Each rebuilt train was unique. Some carried wounded soldiers in makeshift medical cars shielded with painted Red Cross symbols. Others hauled ammunition with machine gunners stationed on the roofs. A few were even fitted with floodlights and search lamps to spot ambushes at night. Their ingenuity extended beyond the battlefield. At times, these men repaired local rail lines to deliver food and supplies to liberated civilians. For many towns, the sight of an American train emerging from the fog was the first sign of stability after years of occupation. They weren't just soldiers. They were builders, craftsmen working in the ruins of an empire, forging utility out of wreckage. And as these fortress trains began to roll eastward, another perspective was forming, one from across the battlefield, among the men who once commanded Europe's rails. For the Germans, trains had long been instruments of both pride and desperation. Since the First World War, their army had perfected armored trains, Panzerzüge, that carried artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and even small tank turrets along the rails. They were symbols of industrial power, rolling fortresses that once thundered across Europe with the precision of an empire. But by early 1945, that age was ending. Allied air dominance had made German rail movement suicidal by day and risky even at night. Bombed bridges, strafed lines, and dwindling fuel supplies had turned their once mighty rail network into a graveyard of twisted iron. When the Wehrmacht retreated, those abandoned trains were meant to deny the Allies any use of them. Few imagined that the Americans would not only repair them, but reinvent them. At first, German commanders dismissed reports of armed American trains, as exaggeration. A Wehrmacht intelligence summary from February 1945 recorded an intercepted radio message describing enemy trains equipped with machine guns and armor plating. The report added dryly, likely refers to heavily guarded supply convoys. Then, frontline units began sending confirmation. Along the Cologne-Durand line, reconnaissance patrols observed train convoys returning fire. Others reported that U.S. forces were operating captured rail engines for support near the front. The disbelief turned to frustration. The same infrastructure that Germany had built for conquest was now helping the enemy advance. To the average German infantryman, the sight was disorienting. These weren't the cumbersome armored trains of old. They were lean, utilitarian, patched together with American efficiency. Crews moved fast, rarely stopping long enough for artillery to zero in. Under the rumble of their engines, every wheel turned with purpose. In several instances, German officers mistook them for deception operations, believing the Allies were using the trains to mask troop movements or divert air attacks. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing supply trains with anti-aircraft fire from wagons, an image that violated the logic of a collapsing front. The psychological effect was sharp. For German soldiers who had watched their own factories crumble under Allied bombs, seeing their trains repurposed by the enemy was more than tactical defeat. It was symbolic humiliation. The same precision steel that once carried blitzkrieg divisions to Paris was now dragging their empire toward surrender. Captured diaries and letters reveal flashes of that realization. One entry, found on a wounded German signalman near Bonn, reads simply, "The Americans are clever. They fix everything we destroy, even our trains." U.S. intelligence officers who later analyzed German reports noticed the pattern. Exaggerated fear of American mobility. German units could not predict where the next train convoy might appear, because the Americans no longer relied on central planning. Each engineer unit adapted independently. That unpredictability gave the illusion of overwhelming coordination. Tactically, the trains also filled a gap the Germans couldn't match. With their logistics broken, Wehrmacht forces were often stationary, pinned by lack of fuel. The Americans, meanwhile, used the very rails the enemy had left behind to sustain an advance that seemed endless. By the spring of 1945, as German resistance thinned and towns fell in rapid succession, the myth of the American fortress trains spread faster than reality could catch it. Even where none existed, retreating units claimed to hear their echoes, the deep, rhythmic thunder of locomotives carrying unstoppable force through the night. And for those who did see them, the reaction was universal. Disbelief, resignation, awe. To them, it was as if the war's machinery had changed sides, and the Americans had simply learned to make it move again. From the enemy's shock would soon come confrontation. Real battles fought from the rails themselves, as these improvised fortresses faced fire for the first time. March 1945. The Rhine crossings were beginning. Allied units pushed through the last belts of German resistance west of the river. Towns like Euskirchen, Remagen, and Andernach lay in ruin, their stations half buried under rubble. Yet through those corridors, American engineers kept the rails alive. The 713th Railway Operating Battalion had restored a usable stretch of track between Liège and the Rhine. Their armored trains, crude but reliable, now ran nightly, ferrying ammunition and wounded men. Each crew knew the danger. The Germans still held pockets of resistance armed with mortars, Panzerfausts, and a will to delay the inevitable. On the night of March 4th, one of these trains, later nicknamed the Steel Convoy, departed from a captured freight yard near Düren. The locomotives were German-built BR-52s, painted hastily with white Allied stars. Behind them rumbled 8 fortified cars. For boxcars plated with steel, 2 flat cars carrying half-tracks, 1 fuel wagon, and a caboose-turned command post. 50 men rode aboard. Snow fell lightly, muting the thunder of the wheels. Ahead, the line curved through a shallow valley flanked by pine woods, perfect ground for an ambush. German units of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division had been spotted retreating through the area earlier that day. At 0220 hours, it happened. A flash in the darkness. A mine exploded under the 3rd car. The jolt lifted men off their feet. One wheel assembly shattered. Almost immediately, rifle fire rattled from the trees. Tracers streaked through the cold air, sparking off metal sides. The Americans reacted like mechanics under pressure, instinctively. Engineers shut down the damaged section, uncoupling the wrecked car. Gunners swung their Brownings toward the flashes in the tree-line. Within seconds, the night erupted with the rhythmic roar of return fire. Inside the lead boxcar, Staff Sergeant Halvorsen, the same man who once wrote home about iron ghosts, ordered the floodlights switched on. Blinding white beams swept the forest. Silhouettes flickered, German paratroopers sprinting across open snow. The train's roof-mounted .50 calories stitched arcs of light through the darkness. A 37mm cannon mounted on a flat car opened up next, firing high-explosive shells into the woods. Each detonation rolled through the valley like thunder. Branches and snow fell in sheets. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but to the men aboard it felt like an hour. When silence returned, the only sound was the hiss of steam escaping from a ruptured pipe. At dawn, patrols found 6 German bodies near the tracks and evidence of a hasty retreat. The mine had been one of several planted the night before, likely meant for retreating German trains, not Americans. The steel convoy limped back to the depot with 1 car lost, 3 men wounded, and a story that spread faster than any official report. Word reached other railway units. The trains could fight back and win. For the Transportation Corps, it was proof of concept. The fortress trains weren't just symbolic. They were practical. Within days, other battalions began reinforcing their own convoys, standardizing armor patterns, adding extra gun mounts, and coordinating with infantry units for security. That single-night engagement demonstrated the strange duality of the closing months of the war. The Americans were fighting with the enemy's machines, on the enemy's ground, yet they moved with a momentum no one could stop. And that momentum would carry them to the river itself, to the crossings that would finally crack the Reich's western wall. March 7, 1945. As dawn broke over the Rhine Valley, Allied reconnaissance planes brought back images that changed the tempo of the war. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. Within hours, U.S. infantry from the 9th Armored Division stormed it, and by nightfall, the first bridgehead east of the Rhine was secure. What few remember is what came next, the logistical miracle that followed. The Army Service Forces had to feed the bridgehead, sustain armor columns, and move supplies faster than any road network could handle. And so, in the background of history's headlines, the trains began to roll again. The 722nd Railway Operating Battalion was ordered to move ammunition and fuel up to the Rhine using captured German rolling stock. Their engineers transformed wrecked depots at Euskirchen and Andernach into makeshift staging hubs. Within 48 hours, sections of track once ruled by the Wehrmacht were carrying trains painted with white Allied stars and guarded by gunners in olive drab. One train, later recorded in Transportation Corps archives as Convoy 21A, became the spearhead. It carried nothing glamorous, just fuel drums, rations, and artillery shells, but its protection made it legendary. 2 BR-52 locomotives in tandem, 6 armored cars with sandbag reinforcements, and gunners from the 104th Infantry riding shotgun on the roofs. The Germans tried to stop it 3 times in one night. Mines, strafing runs, artillery fire, and each time it survived. At Sinzig, enemy 88mm fire bracketed the tracks. Shells screamed overhead, bursting on both sides. The crew kept the throttle open, smoke pouring from the stack, sparks flying from the wheels. Witnesses said it looked like a comet tearing through fire. The German gunners adjusted, too late. The convoy vanished into a tunnel, only to emerge minutes later, still running, its sides scorched but intact. When it reached Remagen, the men of the 9th Armored cheered. They had never seen anything like it, an American supply train thundering through enemy territory under its own armor. One lieutenant wrote, "It was like watching the war itself in motion, heavy, fast, unstoppable." For the Germans, the psychological effect was profound. Their intelligence officers had believed the rail lines west of the Rhine were destroyed beyond use. Yet now they reported continuous enemy traffic by night. Local civilians whispered of steel monsters, running without rest. To an army that had prided itself on efficiency and mechanized mastery, this reversal cut deep. By late March, fortress trains were running day and night, supporting the massive river crossings at Wesel, Mainz, and Mannheim. Each train carried not just supplies but stories, photographs of wives taped inside turrets, radio operators sharing cigarettes with engineers, cooks turning boxcar stoves into kitchens. They were mobile fragments of the American front, living and breathing machines of endurance. At times, they doubled as evacuation units. After the German counterattack near Bonn on March 22nd, one armored train evacuated 140 wounded men under constant shellfire, its steel-plated sides dented but unbroken. When it reached the field hospital at Jülich, nurses lined the platform and clapped. By April, the fortress trains had done their job. The Rhine was behind the Allies, the Ruhr was collapsing, and the road to the Elbe lay open. Their engines were tired, their paint scorched, their crews hollow-eyed, but the tracks behind them told a story of relentless movement, a testament to American engineering under fire. The war was entering its final chapter, and the fortress trains, born of scrap and desperation, had helped carry it there. April 1945. Germany was collapsing in fragments. Town after town surrendered without orders. Bridges lay twisted over rivers that no longer mattered. The thunder of the fortress trains grew softer now, not because they had failed, but because there was nowhere left to run. By mid-April, the U.S. Ninth Army's advance had reached the Elbe River. The Red Army was closing in from the east. Between them, Germany's once mighty railway network was a graveyard of burnt engines and shattered freight cars. Yet, in the middle of it, American trains were still moving slower, heavier, but alive. The 713th and 722nd Railway operating battalions continued to push supplies into the interior. In towns like Kassel, Göttingen, and Hanover, their engineers took over captured yards, clearing debris, laying new rails, and keeping the supply arteries open. What had started as improvised survival machines were now the first symbols of occupation order. The trains that once bristled with guns began to change. Their weapons were removed, their armor plates left scarred with soot and bullet holes. Some were stripped for spare parts. Others were quietly reassigned to humanitarian work, carrying displaced civilians, Red Cross supplies, and food for German towns on the edge of starvation. One train, the steel convoy that had fought its way through Düren, made its last run in late April, hauling medical equipment from Liège to Dortmund. When it rolled into the city's bombed-out station, children watched from the ruins as American soldiers handed out chocolate and rations from the same boxcars that once carried ammunition. For many of the engineers, it was a strange transformation, from fighters to builders, from armored train crews to custodians of recovery. Sergeant Halvorsen, who had survived the night ambush weeks earlier, later wrote in a letter home, "We ran the same route again, but the guns were gone. The only thing we fired was the boiler." Behind every quiet act of maintenance lay the unspoken truth. These trains had outlived the war they were made for. Their crews, mostly mechanics, railroaders, and transport men, were suddenly without a battle. Yet their work continued to matter for POW exchanges, refugee evacuations, and feeding millions in what the U.S. Army called Operation Relief by Rail. German civilians, once told to fear the American iron convoys, now lined the tracks to watch them pass. Not in terror, but in awe. They had seen trains as instruments of conquest and destruction. Now they carried bread, medicine, and hope. By early May, the European war was ending. The engines that had hauled fortress trains through shellfire now stood silent in sidings, their boilers cooling under spring rain. Some crews marked the end in chalk on the armor plating, "Mission complete, May 8, 1945. For the men who built and operated them, those trains were proof of what improvisation and willpower could achieve. They had turned the enemy's wreckage into a weapon, and then into a lifeline. And though few headlines mentioned them, their story became part of a larger truth, that in war, victory often rides not on what is planned, but on what is repaired, rebuilt, and kept moving when nothing else can. As peace returned to Europe, the fortress trains faced one final mission: dismantling themselves, piece by piece, so the tracks could carry peacetime once more. When the guns finally ceased in May 1945, the fortress trains were quietly disbanded. Their men went home, their locomotives returned to rail yards under Allied administration. Yet the lessons they embodied never disappeared. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps filed detailed after-action reports on their construction, performance, and field tactics. Those reports, stored in the archives of the Office of the Chief of Transportation, read less like combat summaries and more like engineering manifestos. They described the thickness of armor plating that could stop small arms fire, the ideal spacing for gun ports, the efficiency of running 2 locomotives in tandem to sustain speed under damage. These were not the grand strategies of generals, they were blueprints for survival. And they would be remembered. By 1948, when the Cold War shadow spread across Europe, some of those same engineers found themselves back in uniform, this time advising on railway security units in occupied Germany. Though the new trains carried no visible weapons, their car layouts and defensive concepts were direct descendants of the 1945 designs. In Korea, a new generation of American soldiers repeated the same improvisation. Facing guerrilla raids along mountainous supply lines, U.S. engineers built train forts using sandbags, timber, and salvaged armor, nearly identical to the designs tested in the Ruhr. Officially, they were classified as mobile rail security platforms, but veterans recognized them instantly. Colonel James Callahan, a Transportation Corps officer who had supervised the fortress trains in Europe, later remarked, "We learned that a rail line is as alive as the men who defend it. You can armor a car, but it's the ingenuity inside that keeps it rolling." The legacy also found its way into Cold War planning. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. Air Force and Strategic Air Command explored mobile launch trains for nuclear missiles, concepts echoing the same wartime principle: mobility equals survival. Even in peace, the philosophy of the fortress train endured, the idea that movement itself could be armor. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of those World War II trains faded. Many were scrapped or repurposed into freight cars. A few survived in museums. One locomotive, a former BR-52 used by American engineers, still sits on display at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia. Its steel plates bear faint dents, remnants of small-caliber hits sustained somewhere along the Rhine. Few visitors realize what they are looking at: a fragment of a forgotten campaign fought on rails. Among historians, these trains remain a minor footnote, overshadowed by tanks, bombers, and grand offensives. Yet within the U.S. Army's own records, their contribution is unmistakable. They bridged the gap between improvisation and doctrine, showing that logistics could be as daring as combat itself. They were born from scarcity: no orders, no manuals, no templates, only the need to keep moving. In the closing months of the most mechanized war in history, American soldiers had turned the enemy's tools against him with unmatched creativity. And in doing so, they proved a deeper truth, that the strength of the U.S. military was not only in its machines, but in its ability to adapt, rebuild, and dominate through innovation. As Europe's rail lines hummed again with peacetime freight, the last traces of the fortress trains disappeared into memory. But for those who rode them, every mile of steel and steam had carried a message that would outlive the war itself. Nothing that moves can ever be truly defeated. The war ended not with a single victory, but with millions of small triumphs. Men fixing, rebuilding, and refusing to stop. The fortress trains were one of those triumphs, a creation born not from command, but from necessity, imagination, and courage. They were not symbols of glory, nor monuments to destruction. They were proof that when chaos reigns, ingenuity becomes its own form of armor. The men who welded those plates, who shoveled coal and manned those guns, never sought fame. They simply refused to let the line go cold. For the Germans who once ruled Europe's rails, seeing those same locomotives thunder east under American control was more than defeat. It was disbelief. Machines they had built for conquest now carried the momentum of their conquerors. In the stillness that followed 1945, the fortress trains disappeared, their steel absorbed back into peacetime industry. But in every sound of a freight horn echoing across a quiet landscape, there lingers an echo of that moment, when soldiers turned ruin into motion and motion into victory. History often remembers the tanks, the planes, the grand offensives. Yet the true measure of power is not always in the weapon that destroys, but in the engine that endures. And on those battered tracks across Western Europe, American soldiers proved something timeless. That even in the wreckage of war, progress can still find a way to move forward.